welcoming Dr. Ellie Zarrabian, host of From Chaos to Connection, growing from pain toward community. Are you ready to make the most of your challenges while moving ahead with your dreams? Do you want your spiritual growth to be part of your healing while living your life with purpose? On Chaos to Connection, you will find resources to transform your difficulties into connections with others. Change is achievable. Dr. Ellie helps you make change both within and in the world. Learn to heal past traumas, become more self-assured, and take action in the world. No matter your spiritual background or cultural heritage, we will work together to transform pain and trauma to community and well-being. You can make this world a better place, starting with yourself. From Chaos to Connection starts now.
Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Ellie Zarrabian, and this is my show, From Chaos to Connection. If you're interested in the topic of personal growth and building better relationships at home and in the world, then you're definitely in the right place. In my previous podcast, I had talked about awakening to a time of renewal, healing, and growth. Given that there's so much going on in and around us these days with so many people struggling, I had discussed the importance of returning to our spiritual source in order to create a more meaningful and sustainable connection with ourselves and with each other. So I thought for this podcast, it would be good to talk about a return to our source in order to work through and even transcend boundaries that separate us and get us in a whole lot of trouble as a global community. I'd like to address this topic through the wisdom of one of my greatest teachers and global unifiers, Rumi, or Molana, as we refer to him in Farsi. Molana Jallaludin Rumi Balkhi, the 13th century Sufi poet and mystic, was born in what is now considered modern-day Afghanistan. He later settled in Konya, present-day Turkey, with his family in order to avoid political and social unrest. His father was a preacher and a religious scholar, and he introduced Rumi to Sufism. Rumi is not only considered an icon in that part of the world, but is also considered the most extensively read poet here in the USA today. Born approximately 800 years ago, this lover of the divine, poet, and mystic has touched the world with his poetry like no other. Basically, who hasn't heard of Rumi these days? Thanks to translators like R.A. Nichols, Robert Bly, Coleman Barks, and Andrew Harvey, Rumi has become a household name these days. In fact, young people are considered pretty cool if they have a copy of the essential Rumi sitting on their bookshelf. So what does this poet, mystic, and great unifier have to say that can help us as a global community do a little better with each other? Before I jump into that, I'd like to share a little bit about my own background with you and how I came across the work of this incredible human being. As many of you know, I was born in Iran near the time of the 1979 revolution, which changed the fate of my country from a monarchy to a theocracy. Overnight, this seemingly peaceful country was overturned when war, revolution, and mass migration of millions of people ravaged the country. Not to mention the hundreds of thousands of young people who lost their lives or became permanently disabled due to a 9-year war with the neighboring country of Iraq. This was the backdrop of my formative years. My country went into a state of complete chaos, and I, along with thousands of other people, in particular other religious minorities, fled the country and took refuge anywhere in the world that would accept us. In our case, it was Great Britain. I lived there with my family for almost 4 years as refugees until we were let into the United States, where we joined the rest of my family. But during those few short years that I was living in a tumultuous Iran, I was also exposed to the most beautiful part of my culture, which eventually helped me turn my life around and to take those broken pieces of my childhood and build a solid foundation and a life that has come to inspire me and those who come to work with me. You see, I was born into a Jewish family in Iran. As a religious minority undergoing a religious revolution, the future for myself and my people did not look too bright. In fact, many thousands of religious minorities, including Armenian Iranians, Baha'i Iranians, Zoroastrian Iranians, as well as countless other Muslim Iranians, fled the country in order to avoid death and destruction. But because of my early childhood exposure to Sufism, or tasawwuf, as we call it in Farsi, the teachings of the great Sufi poets like Rumi and Hafez allowed me to remain closely connected to my roots and still thrive. In fact, my years of work on the teachings of these great poets has helped me create a system of healing, which I use in combination with my skills as a counselor to have first helped myself heal and later my clients. So, what is Sufism? In case you don't know, Sufism is the inner dimension or the mystical and contemplative tradition of Islam, as is Kabbalah to Judaism and mystical theology to Christianity. Mysticism, like all contemplative practices, embarks on a direct path to the divine without an intermediary like the clergy. Instead, it is a direct path between the one seeking and the one being sought. In Sufism, we describe this path of longing as the eventual union of the lover with the beloved. Of course, there are always teachers who help those who are seeking, but the basic premise of these teachings is that you must discover the divine through a personal path as informed by the heart. The path of the heart is not a trivial one. First, you must sharpen and even master your intellectual capabilities, and only then are you ready to embark on the path of the heart. You see, even though I was born into this culture and speak the language, I myself have had to pursue higher degrees like a master's and a doctorate degree in order to be able to comprehend the depth of these teachings. And I'm still a student. I'm not sure if many of my Western friends who love to read Rumi know that Rumi was first and foremost an Islamic religious scholar. Rumi knew the holy book inside out and was considered as one of the youngest and most influential religious scholars of his time. He had a school, many pupils, and many devoted followers who would come from faraway places in order to seek his counsel or to just be in his presence. Essentially, Rumi could not have become Rumi and embarked on the path of the heart had he not first become a religious scholar. Only after decades of study, practice, and diligence was he ready to finally meet his beloved teacher, Shams of Tabriz. Many of you, I'm sure, are aware of the incredible encounter between these two powerful forces and what ensued for Rumi after meeting his beloved teacher. But if you haven't read this epic story between these two, I highly recommend that you pick up a book on Rumi's life and read about his encounter with Shams and how he actually ended up becoming Rumi as we know him today. In Iran and for most Iranians, we revere our Sufi poets close to how we revere our prophets. Regardless of our religious background, it's not uncommon for many Iranians to have a copy of the Masnavi or the Divan of Hafez placed right next to the holy books. For some, these sacred texts even replace the holy books. If you're Iranian and you read Rumi or Hafez in Farsi, you have to have a sufficient understanding of Sufism. Otherwise, reading Rumi in Farsi without any reference to Sufism is like reading the New Testament without any reference to the teachings of Jesus Christ. It just doesn't add up. That's how different it is to read Rumi in Farsi versus English. Here in the West, while we are grateful to translators like Coleman Barks and Andrew Harvey for bringing the work of such a great poet to the West, as Iranians, we look at these English translations with lightness because the bulk of the teachings are missing. Whenever I share this portion of my lecture with my students, inevitably I get a young person who raises their hand and with great hesitation and a look of disbelief says, "But if so much of the work is missing and not translated into English, then how is it possible that Rumi's work is so popular here in the West?" And that question is always music to my ears. How is it possible that so much can be taken out of context, and yet the message still remains intact? And that, my friends, is the power of love. If you study Sufism and understand the philosophy behind the teachings, you understand that love, when embodied with wisdom and understanding, transcends all limitations. That includes limitations of language, race, religion, gender, as well as political and religious barriers. Essentially, the teachings of Rumi and other Sufi masters are the ultimate lesson in cultivating love, peace, and harmony with creation and the Creator. In other words, if you really take to heart the teachings of this great poet, you cannot help but occupy a space other than love. And when you occupy such a space, your life is automatically transformed. People who know me and learn of my background often become curious as to why I have spent so much of my life studying Rumi's work. And my answer to that is always the same. Given my background and difficulties that I endured as a result of what I went through in my childhood, it would not be unfounded or inconceivable that I would harbor great feelings of distance and animosity towards my Muslim brothers and sisters. But you see, that is far from my reality. Just take a look at my Facebook page. You will see that I have a large contingency of Muslim friends from all around the world, and there's nothing but love and appreciation exchanged between us. All this is because of the work I have done on myself based on the teachings of such great teachers like Rumi and others like Ibn Arabi, Hazrat Inayat Khan, and Pir Velayat Khan. Sufism is a path of love, and if you study it with diligence and dedication, you have no choice but to become a reflection of those teachings. I know this to be true, both for myself, through personal experience, and from what I see in my clients after working with me for some time. Let's take a short break, and when we return, I will talk about how I have used Rumi's teachings as a way to cultivate an inner path towards love. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm Dr. Ellie, and today's podcast is about a return to our source by cultivating a deeper connection to the self and to each other using the wisdom of the great Sufi poet teacher Molana Jallaludin Rumi. For this portion of my talk, I want to give you an example of a client I worked with in order to show you how returning to one's source changes our connection with ourselves and with the world. But the full presentation on this client and the work that I did with her can be found on my blog post under the title, Love During the Time of COVID. Please feel free to check it out on your own. Well, it was during lockdown in 2020 when a client of mine whom I had been working with for about 2 years called me up one day in a state of panic. She was a single woman in her early 30s and a successful attorney by profession and working hard towards building a law practice, as well as wanting to find a life partner. She desperately wanted to get married, settle down, and start a family of her own. But the prospect of finding a suitable partner was a daunting task for her. That's why she had reached out to me. She had heard from some of her friends that I was able to help them find a life partner. And so she had contacted me and had come to work with me for the last 2 years. So my client's entire focus during the first 2 years of our work together was towards finding the right man. She felt that finding the right person would be the end of her loneliness and troubles in life. Out of sheer despair, she would cry out, "Why can't I just find a good man? Why is it so hard for me to find a partner and so easy for other women?" The emphasis all along was on her doing something outside of herself to somehow make the right partner show up for her in her life. No matter how much I emphasized that drawing in the right person was first an inside job, that she had to first develop the right relationship with herself, then the right person would show up in her life, she could not wrap her mind around this concept. So she continued to look outside of herself on an ongoing basis, which left her exhausted and depleted. She continued her incessant dating approach to find the right partner, while also continuing to feel frustrated and resentful about her situation. Well, in 2020, COVID hit and we were placed on lockdown. She was beside herself. She called me up frantically that one morning saying she was devastated. How am I going to be able to go out now and meet people? How am I supposed to find the right person now that we are on lockdown? She cried out. Well, this is not an unreasonable concern, right? After all, if you want to meet people and date, you have to go out. Otherwise, sitting at home for a year or two is not necessarily going to help that cause, right? Well, I didn't see her situation in the same way. In fact, I was overjoyed at the prospect that she would finally be able to understand what inner work meant, so she could address her situation from the inside out, rather than continue going outside of herself to find the right solution for her difficulties. So we were on lockdown and could not leave the house, and she was forced to sit with herself and self-reflect on her life and examine how she had been living her life up until then. Reluctantly, she agreed. She promised herself that she would take advantage of the situation and learn to sit still, meditate, and self-reflect. Long story short, after about 3 months of self-reflection, she came into a very deep and sad realization about herself. She realized that she had been spending most of her life longing to be loved. Due to the lack of a meaningful and loving home environment growing up, my client had always been rushing to find a man who was going to come into her life and save her from a life of grief and loneliness. Once we processed this realization of hers together, she knew that such an expectation was simply unrealistic, that there's no one person in the world who has the power to come into her life and save her from herself and all the years of grief and pain that she had endured in her life. Instead, the grief that she felt redirected her back to herself in order to find a more meaningful and sustainable connection to an inner source that would help fill her cup with love from the inside out. She understood then that before she could hope to meet anyone substantial who was going to love her from the outside in, she first needed to find love that came from the inside out. This understanding is very much the premise in Rumi's philosophy, which again is based on Sufi teachings. The love that we seek from the outside is fleeting and ungrounded. To create the right relationships, we must first establish the right relationship with ourselves. Only after we have developed the right relationship with the self are we ready to embark on a positive and loving relationship with others. This is how we establish the right path towards love, peace, and harmony. Once my client became aware of this realization, she was able to pull herself back in and find that deeper connection to herself and to her spiritual roots. She spent another several months cultivating an inner practice that connected her to inner love and slowly began to find a connection that left her with feelings of self-acceptance, compassion, and ultimately of greater inner peace. This newfound connection shifted the way she approached men and even pursued them. This subtle but significant shift in her awareness opened up a conversation with a friend of hers who eventually became her best friend and who later became her husband. Because Rumi's teachings are a philosophy of life rooted in a deep spiritual and contemplative tradition, his message transforms lives whenever anyone goes to him with an open heart and an open mind. This is true regardless of one's culture, language, religion, gender, politics, or any other barriers that separate us. Now, I have always imagined that if all of our Muslim brothers and sisters were to go back and study their roots through the contemplative path of Sufism, and if all my Western friends who love to read Rumi would learn a little bit more about Sufism and its philosophy, we could probably usher in world peace. After all, this is the power of love, and love, after all, is the greatest redeemer of all, isn't it? For the love of Rumi, I'm Dr. Ellie Zarrabian, and this is the Transformation Network from Chaos to Connection. Thank you for joining me for this week's talk. This concludes our 9th episode. Be sure to tune in for our next episode in a couple of weeks. And in the meantime, take good care and see you soon.
You have been listening to Dr. Ellie Zarrabian, host of From Chaos to Connection. Tune in every second and fourth Monday at 2 p.m. Pacific on transformationtalkradio.com for more resources and tools to help with healing on your journey of life. You can impact the globe in the most powerful way possible. Whatever your spiritual background and cultural heritage is, you can transform pain and trauma into building community and connection. Join Dr. Ellie in identifying what you need to heal within and in our world. For more information, visit centeronpeace.com. That's centeronpeace.com.